Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Today, we're going to get to talk to Jim Gust from Expedia, kind of get an update on the work that Expedia has done in their graph journey, specifically since the last time that Jim gave a talk at the GraphQL Summit in 2019 in the fall. So quickly, some introduction or some housekeeping. The way QA works here is you'll see in your GoToWebinar, should be able to ask questions, and Jim and I will try to monitor those questions and kind of guide the conversation. If there is extra time at the end, we'll go ahead and maybe take some of those questions and try to answer them specifically. But while we're going, we'll probably just keep the natural flow of the conversation and try to guide it toward the topics that you all think are most interesting. First, so introductions. I'm Dan Berner. I am the Enterprise Graph Champion here at Apollo. Jim and I worked together at Expedia Group for a number of years while I was there. And Jim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Jim Gust. I'm a technical product manager at Expedia. I worked on a ton of different teams at Expedia, starting on the native app team, working on the GraphQL team, and most recently working on the Trips team, building Trips experiences for our customers for all of our portfolio brands, including Expedia, Orbitz, Travelocity, etc.
Excellent. All right, so I'm always interested in the why. So I thought we would start with kind of the why for the motivation for a company-wide graph at Expedia, and then we'll move kind of into the what, the choices you made, and then sort of finish with the how. So I think that's a big, as I've talked to a bunch of customers, that one of the common themes is how do you scale a big graph, and how do you manage the teams, and how do you do community building? So we'll talk, I think, on that toward the end. So to get us off and going, why don't you have you quickly do Expedia's graph origin story? So what was the motivation for GraphQL and a data graph or a company-wide graph at Expedia?
Yeah, just a couple disclaimers before we dive into it. My own housekeeping. I work for Expedia, but all of my opinions are my own. I'm part of a much larger team here that makes this all possible, and I'm offering my kind of own unique perspective here. But if you talk to a lot of other people on the team, they might have different perspectives. So this is coming from my point of view as someone in my type of role, how I see things on the ground. In terms of origin story, I feel like our GraphQL journey at Expedia was like step 9 or 10 of a journey that had started much earlier than when I had joined. Part of a major replatforming effort that was just kind of in its nascent stages. So we had this huge monolith that was called EXP Web. It's not important for everyone on the call, but just for historical purposes. And we had a lot of issues with living in a monolith as our company grew in terms of number of developers working on it and number of features inside of that monolith and just the general surface area. So things like difficulty of testing the entire platform and releasing it and trying to move into a continuous delivery model. All those things were just pieces of friction that we just couldn't overcome. And so we started this journey of breaking things down into microservices, breaking out into smaller apps so we could do these CI/CD type things as we go. And like a lot of these things we just sort of take for granted now, but were a huge deal back then. And one of the primary drives for us starting this GraphQL project was coming out of the native app team. We were always starved for APIs. We didn't really have all of the same features and functions that the web platform had, because the platform we were coming off of was really heavily driven towards a web experience. Expedia was born out of that early web e-commerce phase, and we hadn't really grown into the native and the mobile world that is the web now. And so the native apps were just kind of an afterthought. the way we serve those native apps was a completely separate API kind of bolted onto the top of the platform. And it always got features after the fact. It had very limited support. There was a team spun up to develop this API and support it. And then that team was moved off to other things. And then the mobile team was left to support it. And so the native apps were never as good as they could have been, or we never got all of the new hotness that the web was getting at the time. And it led to a very fractured experience from a customer perspective. Like whether you were a customer of the web or a customer of the native app, or you use both of those platforms, we could be giving you completely different answers depending on where you interact with Expedia's platform. And that was becoming really problematic. We were getting a lot of feedback from customers saying, hey, this thing doesn't make sense. It works one way here, it works another way there. Like, it's not easy to use, I'm confused, you're telling me the wrong data. Like, all of those things kind of added up. And our answer to that was actually, it started with a design system before we got to the API part. Like, one of the steps along this journey was recognizing, like, we need to have cohesive experiences no matter which platform you're on, whether you're an Android user, an iOS user, or you use the mobile web, or even if you use the desktop. Like, we need to be giving you the same capabilities and our best experience no matter where you interact. And so the design system is the first piece of that. And it really, it's going to come into focus as we get into some of the later parts of this discussion. Like, this is the key part to the experience graph, as we call it.
Mm-hmm. So this really came, in a sense, customer driven. I mean, GraphQL is an API tech, React is a front end tech, but it sounds like what you were after was grounded from the experience, and the model you had of a mobile API gateway sounds like you couldn't get that kind of seamless experience. So then how did it start? So how did you choose a starting point that you could learn from?
You're absolutely right. Like, all of this came from trying to center around the customer. In fact, we had a lot of internal propaganda about, think about things from the view of the customer, think about the end-to-end journey when we're building products and maintaining products. And in terms of where to start, we kind of recognized early on that the way we were organized was not conducive to building cohesive experiences. So in the monolith days, we were really heavily focused on, and even as we were migrating off that platform into a more distributed model, we were really heavily focused on optimizing the silo. And the silo being, like, we've got a team focused on the flight shopping aspect, and a team focused on the lodging shopping aspect, and a team focused on checkout and payments. And so these teams would, in order to move more quickly, laser focus on their silo and not really worry about the end to end. So when we wanted to do something end to end, we had to sell it to leadership and get a ton of buy-in and create these really massive programs with all this overhead to get something that cut across the entire customer journey. So we kind of looked at that and said, we're building all these things multiple times, and it's not effective. We need a much higher leverage mechanism of delivering products. And we thought about this, and we looked at building, and teams were already in progress building back end for front ends. Like, we were already experimenting with this, and it was successful. And that's one of the factors that led into this experience graph idea. But what we realized early on when we were trying to adopt the BFF, which is backend for front end, if you're not familiar, API to multiple platforms, so expanding it beyond just a website, but also serving our iOS and Android native app customers, it was really hard. Like, we couldn't get that application to be flexible enough to serve all those platforms. and GraphQL was starting to kind of take off along that time. So you could say we had the foresight of saying GraphQL is going to be a popular technology, but really I think it was just luck and right place, right time more than anything else. And we started to experiment with this because we had a directive from our product and design teams to say we need native app shopping and web shopping to operate the same. We need to stop building 3 shopping paths. And we said, okay, well, why don't we try to pull some of this business logic back into the API like we were doing in the BFF, but make a BFF for everyone. And that's what we were calling it in the beginning, was the Biffy BFF for everyone. Can we serve our iOS, Android, and web clients out of one API? And GraphQL was just the obvious choice. Like things we take for granted now, a single endpoint, like the ability to query for specific fields and allow clients to kind of adopt iteratively the functions that are available in the graph, and the CI/CD stuff, the tooling that Apollo offers to have visibility of who's calling what and who's making so many requests and who has issues and who doesn't. All of those things kind of just made it like a very obvious place to start to go down this path.
So that makes me think about you. I mean, you had this, you had an inkling of the, you certainly had the brief from product and design about what you needed to do. You had a technology that looked promising, but you've explained that it's a big organization, lots of teams, very siloed. How did you think about beyond your initial go to market with a particular team? It sounds like it was the hotels team. Um, did you think that the core graph team would be able to model the schema for all of those domains? Or what were you thinking about in terms of like how you would, what we say to now, federate, how you would create a system that allows a broad community of people to contribute to some whole? How did you think about that from the early days?
This is such an interesting topic. Like I feel like we could talk for hours just on this alone. We were really deep into this proof of concept GraphQL Summit, and we were kind of, I guess our eyes were starting to open to what the potential of having a single graph would look like, and
Yeah.
and what would it mean if your entire product was captured in a single layer, a distributed service underneath, but really like a single place, a one-stop shop to get everything you need to build a travel website. And the the concept of having a versionless API and the concept of how naming things matter and how that impacts the productivity of your clients was scary to us. We were a couple months into schema design and deploying these APIs and wiring them up and working with clients to adopt the queries. And throughout that learning process, like we made mistakes. We named something wrong, something was shaped wrong. And then we had to work with clients to deprecate those old things and move to the new things. And we were thinking to ourselves, like, who's going to be able to learn how to do this? Like, how are we going to get all of this knowledge into hundreds of engineers and dozens of teams? And we were thinking, like, maybe we do just model the entire graph for the entire company. But we quickly recognized that there's just too much surface area.
Yeah.
And we can kind of go into that here. Let me switch slides here. This is just a presentation I used internally to kind of show other people in the company what we're doing. But this is just an example of one area of the travel website, which is trips. So this is like your post-purchase and your trip planning features live here, and this is across 3 different clients. I believe it's iOS, Android, and web in that order if you go from left to right, and a couple different screens on this funnel. this is meant to be kind of overwhelming to look at. And this is just a fraction of the trip's surface area. Now you expand that to checkout and to shopping and to all the different lines of business and the account pages and everything that makes a website run. And there's no way that a team of what I think it was 6 or 7 people could model this for the entire company. We're going to have to basically skill up the rest of the teams who are working in this layer to be able to contribute. And when we recognize that you can kind of evolve your way out of any bad pattern in GraphQL without making a huge impact to client, again, things that we take for granted today, like the type safety and the code generation on the client side, like that stuff works really well, and it's a huge productivity boost for our engineers. So making changes to the shapes of queries and switching these things out and deprecating old things gracefully over time, it's not a big deal. If your graph is a mess when you start out, like that's not a problem. Just evolve your way out of it. And
This is
once we
so,
kind of figured that
yeah,
out and embraced
yeah.
it, we started getting momentum.
I remember those early days when we were working on this, and we were so concerned about the perfect graph because we were going to bind it to native apps, put them in the app store, and support something for 2 years. And we would just, I remember those iteration cycles were long. And then, but it sounds like you've come a long way in the sense now it's like the game is about evolution, right? It's just like agile. It's just like, it's really about how many iterations, not how good your initial schema is. Um, so tell me what drove that realization for you and your team?
Oh man, I think we might have told this story before. Some people on the call might have heard this already, but when we were interacting with one of our early client teams who were adopting the graph, and we're kind of skilling them up on modeling their experience in the graph, we kind of went hard on, you really need to be thoughtful about your naming process, and you need to be thoughtful about the shape of the graph, and like here are the recommendations, what we learned, and like if you don't follow these best practices, you're going to be in a world of pain. And we kind of frightened this team into submission, and it made them afraid to iterate and made them afraid to experiment, and we kind of recognized that we took away that opportunity to learn and make mistakes from that team. And once we kind of stepped back and said, you know what, it's not going to be a problem. Don't worry about all these things. Just show progress. Just make changes, deploy the changes, um, prototype out your APIs. Like do a spike consuming this API with your clients and see what works well and see what doesn't. Again, that was the opportunity to gain momentum, and these teams started
Yeah,
learning, and they had the experience now to understand why we had certain best practices, and they actually ended up contributing their own knowledge to the set
hmm,
of best practices, and that sort of rising water lifted all of the ships on Expedia's graph. And looking back 2 years ago of what we have in the graph now versus what we had then, I mean it's probably like 10 times the size. It's incredible of like what we have in the graph now in terms of surface area.
there's a real viral adoption that starts to happen on, it's a reinforcing, I think, the clients devs, the front end devs. You start to hear them say, "It's in the graph," like like it's some magical thing that's appeared, a spell that's available to them. And then you get service teams who have been working really hard to deliver some key capability that they know people need, but no one even knows this exists. So this might be an example, might be like, what are the last 5 searches that somebody's done, right? When you have a discovery API out for searches in search history, some people will find it, some people won't. It's a big company. It's in the graph, all of a sudden people go like, wait a minute, I can just query this and I can get this and use it for this use case or that use case. Um, so both of those I think makes the graph grow more quickly, but I want to hone in on one thing you said about showing value versus starting from this top down schema modeling of the entire domain. because as sort of engineer architects, all of us are attracted to this dark pattern of, well, I'm going to be modeling something which is a really neat, important new layer that captures all my capabilities, sort of my nouns and my verbs. I don't want to do that unless I've really thought through like all of my objects and how they fit together and what's going on with the user group and where are we going with, you know, with AI ML. But that pattern, it sounds like your experience is it just leads to paralysis rather than results. And so you kind of have to embrace the fact that build the model that is best. And it sounds like you're still focused on client centric as much as possible, problem centric, product centric schemas, right? These are not REST APIs wrapped in graph. You're actually trying to rethink what the, can you tell us a little bit about that? But you're not doing it in a top down. So there's a interesting.
Yeah, a lot of content packed into that question.
Yeah, that was, I don't even know if that was a question.
Um, I don't mean this to be critical of our teams or of Expedia or of engineering, software engineering today, but I just feel like we don't have necessarily the patience to engage in a modeling exercise like that of modeling your entire product and all of the capabilities of it in say a GraphQL API. The amount of time investment and cognitive investment in doing that is extremely high. And I think we've been trained through agile delivery and just the pain of doing these large design exercises and then having emergent requirements throughout, and your design ends up not fitting what you thought your product was going to be. We just don't think there's going to be a payoff to do that. There's a sweet spot to be found there. Like, it's a good idea to be thoughtful about designing a contract, and specifically with this experience graph or a BFF, having a good contract that doesn't need to be constantly iterated or thrown away is what leads to kind of those step function gains in feature delivery and productivity of your teams. You can really embrace that sort of distributed model and distributed team model when you have a solid contract design and honoring those contracts as part of your normal delivery process. One of the one of the best things in my opinion, and this isn't a new thing in the industry, like having API contracts and sticking to them, but part of the graph adoption was bringing that practice to the forefront at Expedia. And I think it's made a huge difference in how we develop software and how we think about software. And it's allowed us to have these sort of sync ups between previously siloed teams and say, hey, we're going to do this and you're going to do that. And these two things are going to meet in the middle. And here is the contract sitting in GitHub that makes that true. And that's been extremely powerful. So if nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this chat, practice contract design, and that can be as big or as small as you think is necessary. Or you kind of have to find your own model there.
It's, you can really think of the contract as a commitment, right? To honor it. What's great about GraphQL's metadata is that you can have a conversation about that contract change. So you can mark something as deprecated, right? To let people know, look, I made this commitment, I'm honoring it, but I would like to retire it in favor of something better. So you can give a signal and have a conversation now. Whereas before, you just have to get on Slack or something and say, hey, could you stop using this version? We're trying to deprecate it. Essentially, that just wouldn't happen. So do you also, you mentioned earlier about the observability, being able to see who's using what, is interesting, isn't it? For when you're going to have that conversation about deprecation or evolution, um, observability sounds like it's pretty key to figure out even like which teams are making which queries, because everybody can make their own query, right?
Yeah, and in terms of what we're doing with server-driven UI and this experience graph, like it's extra critical that we have that observability because we need like a lot of the premise of this working is that all of the clients, iOS, Android, PWA, are consuming the graph in a similar way. So that the shape of their operations are virtually the same. There might be some
Mhm.
field differences, and that's again, it's a nice to have flexibility feature of GraphQL. We can design objects that work for all of the clients and make specific concessions or enhancements for specific clients without having to like throw all of these fields down to all of the clients and let the client engineers sort out the wreckage. I,
Let,
I kind of want to get
so
into the example so people can
yeah,
like,
I know we're teasing a little bit server-driven AI. I had one more question about um, how you transitioned from the core graph team into the trips team in a more working role. But let's hold that one because I think it's time to go ahead and maybe give some examples. What do we mean by the server-driven UI, and um, what led you to leverage it? It sounds like in the Expedia Trips initiative first. Um, what drove that decision? And maybe you start with the what it is, and then you can explain the why,
yeah,
or whichever order makes most sense.
trying to, where do I start?
Maybe with
um,
the problem that the business
I,
presented.
I mentioned all the way back that we're looking for better leverage, a way to capture our product in one area and almost an answer for build once, ship everywhere,
Hmm.
instead of exposing raw data to all of our clients, playing a huge game of telephone across these different teams, and expecting that we're going to get a cohesive product out the other end. And part of that was we're asking ourselves as we were doing this graph work, and again, this ties back into the BFF experiment, like rather than give out the raw data, why don't we just format the data to the client? And rather than give the client all of the data that we have in our domain, why don't we give the clients just the data they need in order to render the experience? So let's start to do some more lifting on the API side. And we experimented with this, that like there was a path that we went down, and it wasn't like we landed on this overnight. It was
Hmm.
an iterative process to get to this point, but we kind of took that to the next level and said, okay, we've got these different objects in the graph. If we just teach the clients to render things in a list in a certain order, like what would that do? Like let's play with sort and filter as a composed component.
Hmm.
And what if we just started swapping those filters in and out? We teach the client about the different types, like a radio button or a drop down or a checkbox or a text entry box. And we teach them how to match those inputs to arguments in a query. And the clients don't really know what those arguments are or what they mean, but they know what to do with them. And then we started changing sort and filter without the clients really knowing about it. So new filters came into play, old filters were deprecated. We started moving the order of those filters based on what we knew about the customer, and we're like,
Hmm.
wow, this is kind of a powerful concept. Like, we don't need to do a client release every time we want to test a new filter or test the order of a filter based on some input customers have already given us. And from that, the light bulb kind of went on and said, okay, what if we do that for a whole page? What if we do that for a whole like section of the website? And that's where the Trips project was born. The experimenting we had done to that point, and the problem that sort of dropped in our lap of being able to deliver all of this surface area in a short period of time across all of our clients, and to be able to give consistent answers and to iterate on this without having to do tons of client releases every time we make a change, we said, let's give this a shot. Let's server-driven UI the entire page. And not just one page, but all the pages and trips. And so
So,
rather than going by like page by page,
mhm.
line of business by line of business, point of sale by point of sale, we're just like, we're going to do everything all at once, all the pages, huge swing,
So I have a
which is
theory that big
anathema.
changes, right, exactly. I have a theory though that big scary things like that, or exciting things, depending on how you're wired, they require kind of two things. One, an opportunity you see for a better way, which you clearly had some experience, it sounds like, with the server-driven experiments in the select sort and filter panels. But it also needs to be the case that the old way is so painful that you just know it won't succeed. So can you tell us a little bit about why? I mean, what was the alternative to this? If this was some kind of a, looks like, some kind of a systematized handling of lots of different scenarios and variants, what was the alternative, and what experience had Expedia had with doing this the traditional way for trips,
Uh,
let's just say?
it was a huge exercise in program management, to put it nicely. To me, it's like a death march. Like it's an endless grind of going page by page, finding all the requirements, building it 3 times in each of the clients, rolling it out, fixing the defects, like wash, rinse, repeat for every box in the matrix. And it wasn't something we had the appetite to do. We were
What was the
already
brief?
going
So the
down a
mandate,
path.
how much time, when the business said, hey, we'd like to redo trips, how much time were they thinking?
Yeah, and we were already going down this path of migrating the web into the modern web stack. We had a
Hmm.
progressive web application, and we were trying to get trips into that, and it was looking like, okay, we're part of the way through hotels. At this pace, it's going to be another 4 years before we're done with all of trips. And we're like, we have to be able to do it faster than this. Like, there's no way, after all we've learned on the graph team, that we can't kind of come up with a more clever way of doing this faster.
Hmm.
And we went through it, and we did the investigation. We thought we could do this in like a year, or like, we were way aggressive. We're like, we can do this in 6 months. But I think we were being just optimistic because we were excited. Um, but here we are, about a year later,
Hmm.
and we're running at 50% on the web. Like, we've migrated just about all of the core features of trips. Um, so I think it came down to like, how do you sell a big swing like this? Because
Hmm.
you're
Hmm.
not always you don't always get the freedom to just like go off in a dark room and like build this
And that's probably a
massive
good thing, isn't it?
thing on
Those
your
dark
own.
room projects never actually result in as much goodness as you think.
So for us, we just looked at the numbers and said, are you guys ready? Like, hey, leadership team, are you ready for a 5-year migration, or do you want to make a bet and see if we can do this in a year or less?
Yeah.
And it's going to be different. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's not going to be what we're used to, but I think it's going to give us the results we want. And I don't know what it is exactly what we said, but it worked. We got the runway to do it. I think it was definitely some of the capital that we had built up in some of the previous migrations to the graph,
Yeah.
and show it, like you said earlier, like it wasn't just go off, model your entire product in the graph, and then hope somebody uses it not like a year or two in the future. We were actually making improvements to the client experience as we migrated clients to the graph. We were
Let me, yeah, let me pause you there. I'm just going to shout out to all the graph champions that are watching this, that are all trying to champion that see the potential, but maybe you're still convincing some folks within your organization. Um, I think the secret that Jim just outlined is deliver value, deliver value, deliver value, deliver value. And then when you're not sure what to do, deliver some more value. Because what you want is everyone within the organization to to feel empowered, but to see results, because then that creates this virtuous cycle where they're like, hey, that graph thing seems to be really working. I'm hearing good things about it. Or I see a feature. So you go to a big business review and you can say, we did this many more experiments, or we were able to push out a new change faster than we were before, or we were able to decouple a front end migration from a back end migration, or any of the things that we all know the graph can be helpful with. Internal selling and internal focus on customer value, and thus, of course, business value, is just essential to getting to the ultimate dreamy goal. That the idea that you can just throw one long bomb 100 yards and get a touchdown isn't realistic. And frankly, you wouldn't know where you wanted to be anyway, would you, Jim? I mean, it's all an iterative process that you're learning.
Yeah, I feel like this is one area that as a technologist myself and working with a lot of other technologists, like this is definitely not a natural skill for us, is the sales pitch. Um, One thing that I think we did well was we partnered with our product teams to sell this approach, and any product manager worth their weight uh, is good at sales. And so being able to sell to your product team and then helping them help tell the message definitely, I think, contributed to one, being able to do this, and two, actually seeing success.
It's interesting because the product folks, and you mentioned earlier design, maybe you'll touch a little bit on that when you explain how this all works, design system. But those folks, you could argue, felt as much pain as the developers who were dealing with some integrating with 10 REST APIs that were always moving endpoints and versioning, because they couldn't. Well, you tell me, what was the pain that they were experiencing trying to manage 3 clients and all this surface area that just made them open to the idea of another way?
This is my opinion. I'm
Yeah.
not a product manager, but being close to it, we weren't building anything new.
Yeah.
We were taking the scraps of what was available and basically trying to hackathon our way into a better product.
Mm.
And as part of the drive to, one, move off of an on-premise monolith into the
Yeah.
cloud and have more distributed features, we were just constantly rebuilding things that we already had. Now,
Yep.
we were buying down technical debt as part of that process, but from a customer's perspective, our product really wasn't getting any better. And our product managers recognized that, and it was a source of frustration. And so now that we have what I think is a faster way of doing these types of migrations, and it's not a panacea, it's not the right tool for every job. Like, we're getting into a place where we can start focusing on the new stuff, which is really what most everyone wants to work on. Migrations aren't fun. We want to build new features and satisfy our customers and get those reviews that say, Expedia, you're crushing it. I've never used a better travel product in my life.
Look, we've got 20 minutes left. We've teased and teased. Take us through what you mean by server driven, how the design system played into that. And then I'm just now going over some of the questions. So while you're doing that, I'm going to go try to figure out how to address some of the key questions so that people feel like we heard them.
Yeah, happy to dive into this. So for those of you not familiar with what a design system is, it's essentially a way to catalog and codify your brand language and your brand's design into something that clients can produce a UX out of. So think of it like GitHub for design, essentially, and that's like roughly what a design system is. So typically APIs talk in data, and design system and designers talk in Figma and mocks and Photoshop files, etc. And the client's job is to take the data and those designs and turn it into something that's a usable product. So with server-driven UI, we thought, what if we take that job of basically merging designs and data together into something usable a step back, pull it away from the client so that they don't have to invent every piece of business logic, every layout, every piece of localized text, etc. And we can, as an API team, talk to clients in something that they understand, which is the design system. So we started with a very basic group of components and modeled them off of the rules of the design system. So inside the design system, we have essentially like composed components, like higher order components composed of smaller components. So like a card is composed of an image and some typography and maybe a button and some icons. And so we have cards and we have dialogues and we have sheets and we have sections, and these are things that designers use to talk about design, and the clients understand them in terms of here's how much spacing I put in here, and here's the font I use, and here's the font size, and here's the color I make this button, and things of that nature. So we thought if we could model these components, or at least the data necessary to render these components, and talk to the client and say, this is a dialogue, for instance. So you know what a dialogue is, you know what to do with it. We've agreed on a contract of how to map data into a dialogue. So when we send you back a dialogue in your GraphQL response, show this dialogue to a customer. And these schemas are essentially taking the test cases of a particular component and modeling them in data. So to use dialogue as an example, we've got a couple different iterations of how a dialogue can work, and there's different use cases for using these different dialogues. So you might have a single button, you might have multiple buttons, and they might be stacked or they might be next to each other, or you might have no buttons and a loading dialogue with an animation, and then you're going to have different combinations of typography to communicate content and communicate a job to be done to a customer. So when we go into design a schema for this, we say, can the schema satisfy all of these cases? And can the client easily map this data into this design system component and render it to a customer? And there's more to this, but just on the how we model things, this is essentially how we think about it. So we take one of these use cases, it's a dialogue, it's got a heading, it's got some content in it, it's got two stacked buttons, and we have an interface for dialogue. There's some common things that are always going to be there, like there's always going to be a heading, there's always going to be a certain type of content in it, and there's always going to be a place for calls to action. And we're calling this a stacked action dialogue. So this is actually typed. So when a customer requests, give me the things on this page, and we return an object that says type name, stacked actions dialogue, those clients know how to react to that, and they know what to display on the page and how to map each of these things into the component. And that's essentially what we do, is we look at what's defined in our design system, what data is required to make this work, and then how do we model it. And then it's kind of boring to look at, actually. We see a lot of the same fields and a lot of the same types kind of littered throughout our graph. And if we come away with this saying all of this makes sense, it's kind of human readable. I, as a client engineer, can look at this and say, okay, I've got a heading field that obviously maps to heading. I got a body and it's a content type. I know how to parse content types and treat different types of typography correctly. And then I've got buttons, which are also an interface and kind of the same model. Like I can have a primary button, a secondary button, a tertiary button, and they all have their own look and feel. I can now just apply these rules very generally and let the GraphQL response drive what I'm showing to customers. And this is where the leverage comes into play, because we have, say, 3 clients, our iOS and our Android and our web app, all querying parts of the trips graph, which is part of the larger Expedia graph, and saying, hey, here's a union of all the stuff that you can print on the page. Like, give me whatever of these types that you can send me or make sense. And here's some basic context about what I'm trying to do. Like, I want to see the list of my trips. There's a query for that, but the shape of that query just contains components. And then the service is responsible, the GraphQL service is responsible for handling that business logic for all of the clients. So if I have 2 trips and I have to show a card that explains this trip to the customer, I send back 2 cards and the clients know what to do.
Jim, can I put you on the spot? Do you think you want to try to do a live demo?
Yeah, I've got it ready. We can attempt it.
We're gonna try. Go to meeting gods. Please be kind.
This should be interesting.
Yeah. There's a ton of really great questions. We're gonna try to get to them in a speed round right at the end. But if you don't get your questions, you can reach me at dan@apollographql.com. Just email me and I'll get you in touch and get those questions to Jim or answer the ones that I know how to answer. So please, thank you for those.
Can you see
Yeah,
my screen?
I can see this screen. Tell us what we're seeing.
You are seeing on the right our PWA application, and this is all in the production environment. So you might actually see this if you're an Expedia customer today. And on the left, you're seeing my iPhone mirrored onto the screen, and this is our production iOS app. And so I'm signed in as one of our test accounts on both of these, on the browser and the app. And I'm seeing, and this is actually the homepage, we're seeing the same content across both screens. I've got an upcoming trip to Moscow. That's the only thing I have booked. I hear it's a very nice place to visit in August.
Any place would be a good place to visit in August, I think, at this point.
That's true. I mean, just being able to visit anywhere at all would be nice. It's actually weird wearing real clothes. I think this is the first time I've worn this shirt in like a year.
All right, so take us through this. I have tons of questions, but take us through.
This is saying, okay, take me to trips. So I'm gonna tap here. I'm gonna go to trips. And again, what you're gonna see here is the native client and the web client are making the same shaped query, and they're getting back the same results. So we're giving customers the same answers no matter where they go. And we're sending back these different components and they know how to render them on the screen. And so all of these things, this slim card or blade, this hero image, this carousel down here recommending activities in your destination, these are all parts of the design system. And we're talking to the client in terms of these design system components. And that's all the clients care about. They say, what do I need to render? Give me the data. And then they just throw it on the screen. So if we decide in the future that we don't want to show a carousel anymore, we make one change in the GraphQL service, the carousel is gone on all clients. If we want to change what this carousel does and say, you know, we should be showing hotels here because the customer has booked a flight, but they don't have anything, they don't have any place to stay that we know of. We can do that without the clients having to make any change. We just send them down a new carousel and say, hey, here's the new data. And this isn't activities now. This is the most booked hotels in Moscow. And so you can apply that same pattern to all the other components on this page, and you start to see how you can kind of get outsized leverage with a 5, 6, 7, 8-person team working on this. Wow, that is a nice picture. And I'm not sure why the images aren't loading on web. It might be my internet, to be honest.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not signed in. My session expired.
What's interesting here, so those that are listening in, a bunch of people are thinking, wait a minute. The server definition, the schema response, is driving the front ends, but then what are the app teams doing, right? Have you taken away from them the ability to express themselves? So maybe you could talk about what it was that the product engineering teams wanted their app devs to be focused on, rather than sounds like an enormous amount of surface area for static screens like this. What was the opportunity cost that you freed up?
Yeah, I everything is on a spectrum, and server-driven UI is a tool to accomplish a specific goal.
Mm-hmm.
When it applies to something like trips, where we just need to give the right answers all the time, no matter where you come from, because if you're traveling, like you don't want to think about like, oh, do I need to go to the website to do this, or do I need to go to the native app to do this? You want to just be able to do whatever you have to do and travel. So stamping out templates on trips, server-driven UI is really good at doing that. If you're building some bespoke sales page where you're trying to sell something and bring people in and be like really beautiful and engaging, a more data-driven graph approach and bespoke components living and breathing in the clients probably makes more sense for you. But for this job, it makes a ton of sense, and the clients can focus on, I just need to satisfy the contract. I need to make sure that we have implemented all the rules for the design system, and I just need to make sure it runs, and then adopt new types as they're introduced to the graph, and then I can just leave it on cruise control. There's nothing else I need to do. I have all the analytics implemented. I have all the actions implemented. Like any combination that the graph team can come up with in terms of laying components out, we've got it figured out. And so now I can go build my data-driven bespoke experiences like what we saw on the home screen for native app and web. Oh, I'm locked out. Everybody knows my password now. You're welcome. I'm gonna have to change
No,
that.
we can't see. We did
So
not see
like
your
doing
lock.
something like this, like we've got a custom hero image and a call to action. Like this is somewhat, it's a more data-driven approach. It's driven out of the trips graph, but the clients went and implemented this specifically and kind of made it nice looking and custom. So like those are the things, again, I'm not a client engineer, so I can't speak for everyone, but from my experience working with native app engineers, they want to go make beautiful and engaging user experiences that work really well. They want to make apps that are enjoyable to use. So let's let them lean into that, as opposed
You
to
mean they
deciding
don't?
what the date format should be for my trip to Moscow.
Yeah, and rendering insurance on every possible booking state across every line of business over and over again.
It's not an interesting problem. Like
Yeah.
making the user experience better for customers, I think is a more interesting problem. And that's
So
what
I
we were
want
trying
to.
to unlock here.
We're wrapping up at the time limit. I want to make one comment about, just to tie together the design system point you mentioned earlier, which is, it sounds like, I'm going to put some words in your mouth to save time, but it sounds like what you're saying is, just like GraphQL, server driven is a tool in the toolbox. But if your design team and your product teams are telling you, I want cohesiveness, I want seamlessness across all my clients, because I just want accurate, clean representations of data for people's trips, and I don't want differences on Android and iOS and web. That's kind of like what you're saying. Like, that's not a goal. That's actually a bug. So then you're thinking, oh, well, if you don't want that, and you have a design system that your designers, it sounds like, they couldn't even deal with the surface area of all these trip variations, right? Because that would involve too much design. So they built a system, and it sounds like that was your entree point to say, well, if you're going to do a design system for how you're going to compose all these things and standardize flights, hotels, cars, activities, I could probably encode that system into the graph. Is that an accurate? I sorry to stick the words in there, but is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what happened. If you can create a repeatable pattern, you can definitely automate it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of what we did with the graph and with our clients.
3 minutes. Maybe I'll do a lightning round with you. How did you know which bits of the graph that the core graph schema sort of community team was going to hold to as these are design principles we're not going to give in on, and other ones do you just let individual teams and subgraphs maybe vary from your best practices? How did you decide how to create some standards without it slowing everything down?
I think it's gonna differ greatly for every team. Every team has and every company has slightly different challenges based on what their
Hmm.
incumbent tech stack is. But we were looking down a barrel of tons of discrepancies between a lot of different APIs. So tons of extension cords and client engineers having to figure out how each one of these API works. Like, oh, do I have to use this format of a date argument for this API and a different one for a different API? All that stuff, we're like, no, we're not doing that anymore. There's going to be one way to use a date as an argument, and we're going to put that as a type, and we're going to allow our graph developers to share it. As an example, like we just knew we weren't going to go back on that, so we're going to say any schema that gets into the graph is going to follow these basic principles. And we wanted a good developer experience for our clients. Like we want clients to want to use the graph. We want to make it
Right.
easy for them to build experiences. And we also wanted to make it look like it was built by one team instead of like 100 different companies. So those two principles were just okay, maybe you put raw data in the graph and it's not display ready. Okay, maybe you don't follow like the exact naming conventions as every other graph, but we know like these things, a good developer experience and cohesiveness in how the graph is shaped, like we're going to try to stick to those as best we can. And then when we get it wrong, we know we can evolve our way out of it. We
Hmm.
know we can support a backwards compatible graph for as long as we need to, and then create new objects and get our customers using the observability tools that Apollo offers, as well as some internal tools that we have implemented to adopt them and recognize when most of our customers are on the new hotness, and then be able to safely deprecate the mistakes or learning opportunities that we have. And I think we've kind of reached an equilibrium there where it's
Yeah.
it's it's working for us.
I'm probably going to sneak one answer in. We're at time, but there was a question about, are you using federation? We didn't really speak to it, but this is a federated graph. You guys had schema stitching that you built early on before federation was available. And it sounds like that spoke to, I'll just sort of throw another one out, that spoke to this idea of how to work at scale, right? Teams needed to be able to have their own subgraphs, but it needed to be exposed as a common one. Um, and it also sounds like from what you said that there's a leverage play here with tooling, whether it's federation or studio or schema checks or any of those things. Can you speak just maybe in 10 seconds or 30 seconds were you surprised by what your core graph team ended up spending their time doing, infrastructure versus community building? Can you speak at all to that? Because I remember a lot of time spent with really sharp infra engineers helping push the schema design concepts and not having time or wanting to spend their time building infra that they didn't need to.
Yeah. Okay. Couple things here. So
I probably went over. It's 11:01, and we're over the time.
I'll,
Maybe
I'll
we leave this in the bonus round. But
yeah. As far as federation goes, like I think some of the more advanced capabilities of federation are definitely more applicable if you have a more traditional data graph and you have the
mhm,
underlying services that can support that type of composition. For the experience graph, I don't think we're not even close to leveraging like the concept of extensions in federation.
Extension.
We're just not, we didn't think about the graph that way. We're not,
Right.
it's not the problem we're trying to solve. I will say that we did get a performance boost over traditional schema stitching in terms of how quickly the GraphQL server can resolve certain fields
Mhm.
by moving to federation. So that was a sweet bonus.
Yeah, and
But
this
whether you
there's
use
this.
stitching or federation, I think having a single graph
Yeah,
above all else is the important thing.
yeah, and stitching together. We started with stitching, now with federation, a declarative way to say that all of these operations and types belong together in a composed graph. That's federation. You don't have to, it's not just extensions. That's an awesome pattern if you can use it, if it fits your needs, but it's not the place you have to start, which is, again, back to our agile theme. All right, I'm going to wrap. Big thanks, Jim. It sounds like we could do another one of these as a little sneak preview. What I'm going to try to do is have more frequent, what I'm going to call champion table, where we get more folks from the industry and a lot of you that are probably listening to have some informal conversations with a handful of us on these kinds of topics. So we go deeper into one particular one or the other. So there were some great questions about A/B testing in the graph that we could talk about. There's just a bunch of this stuff, and I want to get more voices in there. So look forward to that. We'll be communicating how you can be involved in that. And just, I want to thank everybody for listening, to Jim for sharing his story. And again, if you had questions you didn't get answered, which I'm sure there were plenty looking at them, go ahead and email me, Dan at apollographql.com, and look forward for the announcement for the champions table, and we'll continue the conversation there. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for having me here. I really
Yeah.
appreciate everyone listening to me blather for an hour, and I hope you got something out of it. And if there's any questions that we didn't get to, find me on LinkedIn or
Yep.
Twitter or something, and I'll see if I can help you out.
Yeah, and I could pass some stuff on to you.